All right, welcome back for a final talk of BeerCon2. We're joined by Lennaert, and he's going to talk all about responsible hacking and responsible disclosure. Take it away, Lennaert.
Thank you for the introduction, Sean. And I indeed will be talking about ethics in ethical hacking and responsible disclosure. We'll start with an outline of what I will be talking about today, starting with a short introduction. Then I'll go on to why we're having this talk and what ethics actually are, followed by the principles of ethics, 4 different types of ethical theories, and my personal considerations doing responsible disclosure about ethics, and followed by some practical examples to give an idea of what kind of choices you can be making. Starting with my introduction, I'm Lennaert. I do volunteer research for the Dutch Institute of Vulnerability Disclosure. You can find me on Twitter at Lennaert89, and I sometimes blog over at the URL you see on screen, but very infrequently. So we'll start with why we're having this talk. And when I pitched the slides or the CFP for this, I spoke about it with Scott McGrady, cybersecurity expert, and asked if it would be interesting. And he went on, I don't even know what 2 of these words mean. So we take it that even though we use the term ethical hacker a lot in our industry, we apparently don't really know that much about ethical theory or ethics in general, really. So we have quite a poor understanding of it, I would say. So that's why we're having this talk, and I'm hoping to give you some tools to make the decisions, to make the right decisions when ethics are in play. And that brings us to what ethics actually are. So they're the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. That's according to the Oxford Languages. And then Merriam-Webster says, the discipline of dealing with what is good and bad and with moral duty and obligation. Note that none of these definitions really speak about legal or illegal, while we use the term ethical hacker often to refer to legal hacking. But according to dictionaries, legal or illegal is not necessarily the same as ethical. So then what is ethical? What are the ethical principles? Well, we'll go on about that. The first one is beneficence, or the doing good to benefit society, do what's right and good. Strive for the greatest amount of good you could possibly strive for. Another principle would be that of the least harm. So when you can't do good, at least do the least harm you possibly could. So minimizing the negative effect. And there are no good choices, try to make the least bad one. Another principle would be respect for autonomy. So that would be respecting the capability of the other, or in this case, the organization you're disclosing to make their own decisions. After all, only they really understand their motivation for having made certain choices, and the way that they might be dealing with your report to them, you might not really understand it and might get frustrated by that. But you have to remember that they know their own reasons for doing what they're doing the best. And you can't know all their considerations or feelings, etc. So respect their autonomy and allow and enable them to make the decision. Do your disclosure, but don't get too upset if they're not exactly going to do what you would want them to do ideally. And the last ethical principle I wanted to talk about would be justice, or doing the right thing, doing the fair thing, and doing it consistently. So good decisions in an ethical dilemma are fair, and it should always be the same in similar cases, in my view. So when you have the same kind of report to 2 different companies, deliver it in the same way. This brings us to different types of ethical theories. The first one would be deontology, or adhering to one's duty, one's obligation. So someone that follows ethical theories in this would always be following the law and would be very consistent in the decisions he makes. Downsides of these are that there's no logical basis in it. It's only simple, the duty, follow the law, obey the obligations that you have, but there's no real logic, and there's a huge potential for conflict. You could say it's your obligation to be on time for meetings. Other people are expecting you there. You should be on time. But what if you're running late? Is it okay to speed to get to your meeting faster? Because you would be, keeping up with your obligation of being on time. But then again, you would be breaking the law or breaking the obligation to not speed. So it doesn't give us a very good way of making a decision when there's a conflict. Which brings us to utilitarianism, or the greatest benefits for the greatest group. This has another set of problems where you try to do the best for the biggest group, but it means you would have to predict the exact outcome of all your actions. And you can't always know exactly what the outcome would be. So predicting that is hard. And it doesn't concern itself with individuals, really. It just wants the best for the greatest group of people. So if you put that into overdrive, you could be talking about a healthy person walking into a hospital. Well, we should probably take all his organs and cure 7 sick people. One person suffers, but 7 people benefit. That would be the greatest benefit for the greatest group. And I think we can all agree that that would clearly not be an ethical action to do. So these theories too have their own problem. Then there's also theories that concern about rights. And with rights, we take the rights that are established by society, and they're given the highest priority. They need to be protected. And if someone has the right to do something, one would say it's ethical to do so. But it doesn't really look into how we're establishing these rights. You would need a secondary ethical theory to lean upon to get to and establish these rights. So on its own, it's still not very useful for making an ethical decision, and it's actually quite hard to make an ethical decision looking at all these. The last ethical theories are those of virtue, which means that they mostly look at the moral, the reputation, and the motivation of an individual for whether or not actions are right. I would say Scott is a good guy. He does the right thing. Even though this decision wasn't perfect, we'll still consider it ethical because we consider Scott an ethical person. This leaves very little room for change. And it leads us to that actions from 2 different people, even if they're the same action or comparable, might be judged differently. Someone that's known for fraud, you might judge very harshly for filing something wrong. Whereas someone that's known to not be fraudulent and usually do things good, you might let it pass off and say, it probably is an honest mistake. It's the same action, but we're judging vastly different. It also leaves very little room for change. Someone might have done something bad in the past, and then they're still being judged for that. Not considering them to have changed, became a better person, grown. So the theories that fall under virtue are also very hard to consistently make good and ethical decisions. That brings us to how I would personally try to make ethical decisions when doing responsible disclosure or ethical hacking. In my views, your actions should always be proportional. So try to pull only a single database record instead of dumping an entire database when you want to prove something like SQL injection. They should also be confidential. If you hack a target, don't run to a journalist. Disclose it to them and only publish about it after everything has been fixed. And you should always choose means that are least infringing. It's super cool to have code execution somewhere, but you probably want to run something not very interesting instead of popping an entire shell. You probably, if you can have a file inclusion, want to pull a config file that does not really contain sensitive data instead of pulling a password file. And last, I think that everybody has a right to a responsible disclosure. Even if I really dislike someone and think that they're a bad company or a bad person, if we find a bug in a scan or see their IP for some vulnerability, we will still be disclosing to them, considering that everyone has a right to responsible disclosure. Which brings me to a practical case, in this case, a remote code execution in the WordPress Disqus plugin. We had a few options to disclose this, or to scan for it rather. We could check the version. This turned out to be very inconsistent because the plugin needed to be configured in a certain way to allow you to pop the remote code execution on it. So this would have resulted in a lot of people getting a false notification that their WordPress site was vulnerable. And we decided that that was not what we wanted. So just simply checking for the version of the plugin and notifying based on that was something we did not really consider beyond that point. It would have been really nice because we would have not had to infringe on anything, could have just checked the versions and sent out notifications. So our next option was, are we gonna run code? Like, are we gonna pop the remote code execution to prove the vulnerability across, well, a few hundred sites in our scans that turned out to be vulnerable to this? We thought about it. We would have rather done something less meaningful. We eventually decided that running PHP info was still code execution. It would still prove our point. And it was the least infringing thing we could think of at that point. So this brings me to the point I made earlier. Is ethical the same as legal? Is, well, running remote code execution on someone else's website is probably not legal, I'm afraid. But does that make it unethical? I don't believe so. The goal was to notify them of the vulnerability, not infringe on any of their rights, and to reach greater benefits of protecting all the users of their sites. So we considered it to be ethical in this case to run a simple PHP info command on the servers and then notify website owners with proof, hey, look, your plugin is vulnerable. You probably want to update this because their users, their info is at risk. Another practical case, and this is probably one that most of you would have seen, is the one of DI and Giggle. The good old Giggle HQ has a security team. We don't need random Twitter people. Their disclosure was, in my view, absolutely ethical. They did the right thing by warning Giggle. There's just a lot of info on that app, and it's really sad to see how the researchers were treated after trying to disclose initially. Not sure if a Twitter DM is really the best way to reach a company, but that's what they had to work with. And well, things went quickly south from there, from reaching out privately on Twitter to being ignored, to sending a quite public reminder to, yo, please check your DMs, and leading to all the researchers and the company account being blocked on Twitter by Giggle. Which poses the question, how ethical is it to poke at something that no one really asked you to poke at? And that's a tough call because, you know, it's their app, it's their platform, you're going to poke at it unasked. Is that ethical? I think it can be defended by the greater good for the greatest amount of people, because a lot of innocent, unknowing, well-meaning users will be using the application, and they won't quite be able to, you know, judge if it's safe to do so, if their information is stored safely, whereas a researcher will be able to judge these things and, you know, help make the users more safe. So in that view, I do think it's ethical to do, but I can definitely see, you know, they're being asked questions of, hey, if there's no obvious bug bounty program or other thing giving you the rights to poke at it, it can be viewed as unethical. One of the things that DI wrote on their blog of the write-up of the case that I found very interesting was, denial is not uncommon when trying to disclose. Well, this is very obvious. We're used to being ignored and even getting some pushback, but ultimately we feel it's our responsibility to persist and ensure the personal data of users is protected. So it seems they are thinking along the same ethical lines that I was of, you know, protect the users, even if the company might not want you to do so. And last but not least, I have a sort of small personal situation. This has been running for about 6 months now that I pulled the image that you see from a website. It's their source, which is leaking with a nice array of hard-coded passwords. If you recognize this code, please do answer my emails. It's quite a sensitive site. It stores a lot of information users probably don't really want to see out in the public. They have no clear way to report this. They don't have any social media. I can reach out to them. All they really have is their customer service, because they would like to take your credit card, and their customer service is probably quite helpful if you're having payment issues. I mean, I'm sure they're happy to take your money, but they don't seem quite happy to answer emails about, hey, your site's quite broken. So customer service will not give me any technical contact details, just like tells me it's impossible to put you in touch with anyone technical. We can't do that. So I eventually decided to disclose my report of what was going wrong directly to customer service, which is not something I'm a fan of, because they're clearly not the people that are going to be able to do something about it. But nothing happened. I have no idea if they even passed it on to someone technical or not. I just never got an answer on that email. So as an exercise for the audience, we're now 6 months later, and I'll leave it up to you what I could potentially do about this one, because I can't find people to listen to me. Should I just publicly disclose and see it burn? I wonder what you guys think might be the right way to go about this. And as a final slide, do you have any questions? Please ask them. And I want to say a big thanks to the beer farmers, sponsors, mentors, and everyone else making this possible.
Thanks, Lennaert. Awesome talk. Something I'm quite passionate about, because I've experienced very much similar things that you've talked about. And often I think responsible disclosure can be both rewarding and extremely frustrating. So I actually had a question. But before I do ask it, there is a question from B. What's your take on platforms which we're using and we find to be vulnerable and later try to disclose to companies? Would that be ethical? If so, why? And if unethical, why?
I think it's definitely ethical if you're using a platform to disclose to them. I think if you put it out on the internet, then you're just asking for it to be poked at, like someone's going to do it. So if you're using the platform and you see a bug somewhere, I would absolutely encourage you to disclose it to them. Like, write a good report, be as clear as possible in what you think is happening and the steps you took to reproduce this issue, and hope they would listen. I mean, for me, it's if it's on the internet and someone's going to poke at it, and I think that's okay.
I mean, that's a good way to look at it. It's not like the attackers are going to go, oh, it's on the internet, I don't own it, so I'm not going to poke at it.
No, I really like the old mantra of that's out of scope, said no attacker ever.
Exactly. So I had a question. It kind of relates to that issue that you had. I'm fully on board and aware of full responsible disclosure, but do you feel that there comes a point where you've given them enough opportunity to address the issue and they're still ignoring you, that possibly going to the social media might help? Like, for example, one instance that I know of, I disclosed something, I got ignored. A year later, it suddenly exploded on Twitter, and within a week or so, it was suddenly fixed.
I think going on social media for your disclosures is generally quite bad, because, as I said, I think disclosures should be confidential. And if they're ignoring you, a lot you often see is sort of the risk that people just go to social media because they're upset, they're annoyed, or they want to stroke their ego and just show off. And I think for all those reasons, it can be a bad move to do. But if no one's listening to you and you can't get in touch, and you think the impact of the issue is big enough that it might either be actively abused, or might on short term be actively abused by people with ill intentions, then I think it's very fair to go on social media, because you're going to mitigate harm by doing it. You would get the problem fixed. If the only way to get it fixed is by going to social media and calling the company out, then so be it. For instance, the recent disclosure of the Donald Trump email hack went through social media because the researcher felt that he had no other way to get in touch. Like, he considered it quite a big risk that the account was that easy to log into, especially with the elections coming up and everything. And the consideration was, okay, if I do nothing, then something potentially bad can happen. And what's then the only way to get attention for this? Well, go onto social media. It's sort of the same thing the guys from DI did when disclosing to Giggle. And I think it should absolutely never be your first step, but it can be warranted in certain scenarios. I hope that answers your question, Ashel.
Yeah, and I completely agree. My personal opinion is give them a chance, a sufficient chance, and if not, then try, because at the end of the day, it's helping the users more than anything, because they're going to ultimately be the ones affected.
Yeah, and by go on social media, I mean call them out and not just 0-day drop whatever the vulnerability was.
Yeah, I would recommend that. Scott,
I would not consider that very ethical, to be honest.
No. Scott, do you have any questions?
Yeah, we got one through from Nikos. But before I read that one out, I just want to say it's really important to have the discussion around responsible disclosure and vulnerability disclosure. It's really easy. I know we've said it a million times. I'm kind of bored saying it, but it's really easy to see something on Twitter, jump on a bandwagon and beat a company around the head, even if they're being ridiculous, even if they're being objectively stupid compared to us. But as we've heard from multiple speakers who, like Gerard, like James, like everybody that has kind of come from a different industry or had a different experience and goes, here's what your work impacts in this sense. We have no idea how they're taking it. So they could take it as a troll or as an attack. So having the discussion is really good. And I think Mike's talk really ties in nicely about understanding how your message is going to be interpreted by the other side before you send it, and how you handle it. It's really important. I'll ask Nikos' question now. Any opinions on intermediaries for responsible disclosure, HackerOne, etc.?
If you mean intermediaries as bug bounty programs, then I think they're a good thing. I'm not entirely sure if the researchers really financially benefit from it, and I would personally not pick it as a career. But if you mean intermediaries as like just a company you disclose to and they'll go and do the entire disclosure for you, I know there's a few of them around. I prefer not to use them if I have other options, because it means I'm telling a third party about a bug before really speaking to the company that is impacted. So I prefer not to use them, but if there's no other way, or if the disclosure is being absolutely painful and a company is being horrible to work with, then I can totally see why you would use an intermediary and just not have to deal with that shit.
Okay. Yeah, no, listen, thanks for that. Does anybody else have any questions in the room for Lennaert?
No, I just want to again say awesome talk, really good points. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me the chance to speak. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and before we wrap you up and say thank you, I just want to say a big thanks, because not only are you speaking at this, you and Gerard are the two speakers. You're both on today, but you had like a slight disadvantage where you were working for us behind the scenes in the green room and helping all the other rookies. So you didn't get that whole, you got to sit yourself and tweak your slides up to the last minute. You're busy helping others tweak their slides. Massive respect and kudos to you for that. Thank you so much. We couldn't run an event without people like you behind the scenes. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant talk. Mike, Sean, any last words?
No, nothing really. Can't really add much to what you just said there, Scott, other than echo.
Thank you, guys.
Echo. So just for anyone who's interested, we're going to take a 1.5 minute break. We'll be back straight after the video with a closing speech.